Today, the 7th of November 2024. I'm your chair, Councillor Mike Goodman. This meeting is being recorded and is live on the Council YouTube channel. There's no fire alarms anticipated today. If the fire alarm sounds, please leave the building through the nearest fire exit, following the green running man signs above the doors, and make your way to the rear of the car park. The organiser of the meeting will tell you when it is safe to return. Please make sure all your phones are either muted or switched off. All councillors have been sent the agenda for today's meeting. Any members of the public who want to view the agenda can do so by visiting our website, www.eastdevon.gov.uk. So, pardon?
The website's not working.
It's down.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. No idea. Well, the website.
Normally the website. Thank you very much. Does any councillor have any comments on the minutes of the previous meeting held the 11th of July? Councillor Barlow.
Chair, I don't know if this is the right time, but should we have a point on the minutes of the actions from previous minutes? Because obviously I just wanted to check through, have we done what we said we were going to do or not?
That's not a question, but I'll take it quickly now. I did that exercise about a month, 6 weeks ago, and it's going to be part of our training when we have it in November to review that. But going forward, there's a new system that they're introducing that will take all actions into a spreadsheet, so we will know what has not been actioned and what has been actioned. That's a good point.
Thank you, Chair.
So, agenda item 2, apologies. We've got apologies.
Chair, we have apologies from Councillor Jenny Brown, Councillor John Heath and Councillor Joe Wibley. So just to confirm, members present in the meeting are Councillors Barlow, Councillor Bloxham, Councillor Chapman, Councillor Davey, Councillor Goodman, Councillor Anne Hall, Councillor Matt Hall, Councillor Hartnell, Councillor Johns, Councillor Levine, Councillor McKinder and Councillor Toy, and the meeting is quorate.
Thank you. And I know that Joe Wibley has a statement he would like read out for tonight because he cannot be here.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So Councillor Wibley has written, I have read, processed and asked questions via email regarding the climate change target report tonight, and I will watch the meeting on EDDC's YouTube feed. However, we have asked 15 councillors and associated officers and staff to travel from across the district in cars, not renowned for their zero carbon emissions, to hear a report on climate change targets. This seems comical to me. In all good conscience on this occasion, I really feel that this is not appropriate. It may be a tiny amount of carbon released by meeting in person, but we're either behind the climate initiative or not. This is a perfect example of where a virtual or hybrid meeting could be used to reduce our impact on the environment. In short, please accept my apologies for tonight's meeting.
Okay, we note those comments. So agenda item 3, declaration of interest. Mindful of the code of conduct, do any members of the committee have any declarations? Please state your declaration, including which agenda item your declaration relates to, state what exactly the interest is and the specific type of interest you are declaring. Are there any councillors in this meeting who want to declare an interest, Scar, outside the committee first? And now inside? No one, thank you. Public speaking. One member of the public has registered to speak, but is unable to attend, and a statement is going to be read out. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. The statement is from Mrs. Anne Membry. As an EDDC tax-paying person, I would like it to be scrutinised if the £190,000 paid to the consultancy company WSP to produce the 10-year strategic plan report for Exmouth was justified. I have listened to the report on the placemaking in Exmouth Town and Seafront Group Zoom recording, and the report seems to contain a lot of suggestions for Exmouth that do not seem feasible. I have attached a copy of the statement I read to the placemaking in Exmouth Town and Seafront Group on 9th of September 2024, in which I made comments about why aren't there more improvements happening in Exmouth now, and I received the same answer from the project manager as I have been given before, that it has gone to consultation. I would like it to be scrutinised why the online consultation was so difficult to complete and how many people completed the consultation, And when will the public know the results of the consultation? It's the end of Mrs. Membry's statement.
Well, that is obviously a very specific question to ask, and I think we need to refer that to, is it the placemaking, is there the placemaking team to review that?
I have a response from the
You have, right.
So, members, this is the response from Naomi Harnett, who's corporate lead for major projects and programmes, in response to Mrs. Membry's statement. We are currently reviewing the Exmouth placemaking plan internally, reviewing the projects that have been identified through extensive consultation. Part of this review is to consider the deliverability of the projects, but not wishing to lose the longer-term aspirations for the town. This review will also consider funding for each of the projects, so EDDC and partners can support delivery. This work will be considered by the Placemaking in Exmouth Town and Seafront Group at meetings in the next 3 to 4 months. EDDC have worked with WSP to undertake this work, who are engaged following a formal procurement exercise. The Commission includes a number of work packages that have required extensive technical work, as the Council does not have the expertise in-house. The cost of this work has been carefully monitored to ensure that EDDC has achieved value for money. With the request for additional budget to conclude this work being carefully considered, but essential to conclude this important piece of work for Exmouth placemaking. With regards to the consultation, EDDC works to engage with all parts of our community, but realise that there are hard-to-reach groups. The monitoring data, age, gender, etc., helps us to understand the profile of our respondents. We also work with our communications colleagues to ensure that our consultations are accessible. If respondents are having difficulty in responding to consultations, there is always officer support available. Naomi Harnett says, I am very happy to meet with Mrs. Membry to discuss her concerns in detail.
Fine, thank you. I think that's a good explanation and a good answer from the officer. Thank you. So item 5, matters of urgency, there are none. Agenda item 6, confidential items, there are none. Agenda item 7, decisions made by the Cabinet including portfolios called in by members for scrutiny in accordance with the overview and scrutiny procedure rules, there are none. So move on to the substantial item for tonight, agenda item 8, climate change report, pages 8 to 62. Before I hand over to Matt Blythe, Assistant Director, Environmental Health, and Catherine Causley, Climate Change Officer, to present the report and take questions, we have received apologies for this meeting from Portfolio Councillor Maxim Rickson. Councillor Rickson has sent a statement which is now going to be read out for us.
Me again. Councillor Rickson's statement. In the year since the last report to Scrutiny Committee, the Council and the country have been through a huge amount of change. 2024 is also the final year of our original climate change strategy. The climate change team has been working in the background to review the strategy for 2025 and onwards, and to ensure that the related action plan will deliver the required carbon reductions. Full membership of SWEG at Exeter University allowed us to work in partnership with them to produce the carbon descent plan. This significant piece of work gives us a theoretical roadmap to follow with regard to reducing our carbon emissions by 2040. SWEG met in 2024 with all services to suggest how they can help us deliver future reductions. This work is playing an integral part in our ongoing review of both the strategy and action plan. It is important to note that 79% of all emissions relate to just 2 areas, our own housing stock and procurement, both of which present significant cost challenges. More specifically, point 1, social housing emissions will be extremely costly to address, and as highlighted last year, a much more serious injection of money nationally will be required to enable us to retrofit all of our properties. When will this be forthcoming? And point 2, procurement has been described as very high level by SWEG, and they have recommended we should obtain more accurate supplier-specific figures. Please note that comparisons with other authorities can be misleading, as some councils are failing to include Scope 3 emissions in their calculations. As stated in the report, Removing Scope 3 and social housing from our emissions would show an approximate 20% reduction from 2018 to 2024. However, this result would be disingenuous, which is why we have not adopted this approach. On a more positive note, Table 1 gives a summary of delivery to date, and I am pleased to note that 67% has either been completed or is ongoing, and that 23%, whilst ongoing, requires further work to move to business as usual. No actions have been assessed as not achieved, and 10% are no longer relevant. I am delighted to see there have been significant achievements during the plan period, as highlighted in the report in Section 4. I would like to thank the Climate Change Officer and all services which have stepped up to deliver such a wide range of results. As stated in the report, the majority of actions have been successfully completed or are ongoing. However, we are not complacent and realise that there is much more to do. As our team is very small, the recruitment of a climate change manager is welcome, and I'm sure that all services will continue their drive to implement the changes needed to move towards our net zero goal. End of Councillor Rixon's statement.
Thank you. Now I'd like to hand over to Matt, who is going to do a presentation and then take questions at the end or as they go through. How would you prefer it?
Probably at the end would be
The end.
if that's okay.
So make a note of your questions and we'll ask them at the end. Thank you. Matt.
Still don't like me. Thank you, Chair. So what I've produced for this evening is a sort of a summary presentation of the report. Now, obviously, it is a bit of a summary, so if there are any areas that I do miss, obviously, please feel free to pick up, and if there's something I've missed that you feel is important, very happy to take questions later on the contents of this and also anything else within the report and the appendices. And I've ably supported tonight with my colleague Catherine, who's also here to help me out with the technical details as well. Now, just before I get going, it was pointed out to me that I have made a mistake in the report, for which I apologise. It was to do with the very beginning, which is to do with the introduction, and it did say in there that the action plan and the strategy were taken to Cabinet in 2020 on the 8th of January. They were actually separate meetings, so apologies if that was slightly misleading. So, where we are at the moment is we said we committed to do an annual review on climate change and our progress. So this has been a little while coming now. I think we've had this booked in for the last few months on and off for various reasons. So it seemed like, because this coincided also with our 5-year review of the action plan and the end of the strategy, this seemed like a good opportunity to actually look at how effectively how effective the action plan has been, and also what we think in terms of moving forward and the lessons learned from it. So it seemed like a good opportunity to bring that to scrutiny and look back on what's been achieved so far. So in terms of the introduction, just picking up that, so in 24th July 2019, as I'm sure some of you remember, it was resolved that we would sign up to endorse the Devon Climate Emergency Declaration. On Cabinet on the 8th of January, it was a climate change strategy that came forward for approval, and the strategy just set out the Council's vision to become a carbon neutral council working with a low carbon economy and lifestyle, reflecting our travel, homes, businesses, business experience and communities. So a very wide ranging overall aims. And the overall target is to reduce carbon emissions annually and to be carbon neutral by 2040. And as I said, the strategy and action plan were due to be reviewed after 5 years. Technically, the strategy stops in 2025, so we do need a new strategy anyway. The action plan was written until 2040, but I think for anyone who's ready can realise that actually it does need quite a lot of work to bring that up to date anyway. So hence why this seems like an opportune moment to review that. So this report updates Scrutiny Committee on progress of the Climate Action Plan 2020-2040, analyse the level of achievement of actions, highlight where we've made progress, reflect on challenges, lessons learned, and recommendations for approaches. So this is our current position. Hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at it in the report, because there's quite a lot of information in there, quite a lot of data, and it's not easy to pick out. So what we have there in the graph is our carbon emissions overall for the council between 2021 and 2024. So we've literally just in the last few weeks had our carbon emissions for the previous financial year. Now what you will notice there is that there's a slight general upward trend. Now within that, so our overall emissions have gone from in 2021 from 21,600 just over to 26,200 last year. Not where we want to be. If we break that down a little bit, you see the different colours within the bars. The yellow is procurement, the scope 3 emissions as they're known, so that's services and goods that we buy. The brown is our transport, and the blue is our buildings. So that's a broad brush sort of breakdown of our emissions. What you'll see is that the blue, after a slight rise in 21-22, actually dropped quite significantly in 22-23 and maintained that in 23-24. That was mainly a result of a reduction in our social housing, so it dropped about 2,000 tonnes. The transport has stayed somewhere about the same, and the procurement's gone up significantly. Now, we believe the reason why procurement's gone up is because the way that we measure carbon emissions in relation to procurement and the goods we purchase is based purely on costs. So if we spend £1 million, there'll be an allocation of carbon to that. If we spend 500,000, it'd be half. So it's a very blunt tool for that thing. So as we spent more money, and that could be anything from buying pens to putting a new seawall. So it's quite wide ranging in that sense. So procurement's gone up, bills have gone down, transport stayed about the same, but overall we are looking at an estimated increase, slight increase. So if we split out, and as it was said before in Councillor Rickson's statement, some councils do pull out scope 3 because they are notoriously difficult to pin down, and also because not everyone has social housing, we pull those out as well. So this illustrates that. Now what we've done here is in 2018 and 19, which is the very first year we did a footprint, which we've got data for, which wasn't in the previous slide. It's just to show where we were in that year. And you can see that in 2018-19, we're at about 5,000 tonnes for those areas. That dropped significantly, and there was a year missed because of COVID into 2021, and then bounded back after the pandemic to sort of relatively stabilise over the last 3 years. So again, you can see that the grey, the owned vehicles, that's things like our refuse fleet, they stayed relatively constant. The leisure centres had a massive drop, as you'd appreciate, over COVID, but then bounded back, but not by as much. And our corporate estate has sort of relatively stabilised. So since 18-19, there was a drop, but then it's pretty much maintained constant since. So some key points, so I've mentioned some of these already. 18-19, it has dropped significantly, but it's flattened since 2021. Majority increases from procured goods and services are so-called scope 3 emissions. Of our makeup, the vast majority is from 2 areas, procurement and social housing. They make up almost 80% in their own right of our emissions. And I've already mentioned about the high-level calculations for procurement. But we have seen reductions in social housing and also a little bit in corporate estate and owned vehicles. So moving on, this was given in Appendix 1 of the report. So we had our action plan, which was set out, has been set out for a number of years, and it's been on our website for all that time. It had 82 different actions in our action plan, and what we had to do was to carry out a review of how we felt those were going, and we RAG rated them, so red, amber, green. That, as you can appreciate, was quite a qualitative approach because there's very little in the way of numbers in the original action plan. So it's very difficult to actually assign any element of success in terms of carbon reduction from the original action plan. So all we could say is, did we achieve it? Have we partially achieved it? Have we not achieved it? And that was assessed by a variety of assistant directors, service leads and members of the green team. So given their input as to where they felt they were. Now, I have to say tonight, if there are specific questions about our success in achieving those targets, those that we deal with within our service we can answer. to be honest, we're reliant on other services on the information they've given. So if there's something outside our service you want to question or pick up, we'll have to go back and talk to them about it. Very happy to do so, but it may need to be done outside the meeting. So anyway, based on our assessment, 2/3 we think we've achieved. We had about a quarter where there's been ongoing work, and that's open to how far we got with some of those, but about a quarter where we've made some progress, but more is required. None of the actions that we had in there had nothing against them. And also, because of the 5 years since we originally brought in the action plan, some things have just fallen by the wayside. They don't exist anymore, or we no longer do with them. And again, they're illustrated within the actual review document. And as I say, there were 82 actions within the action plan, which we've gone through. I thought it would be helpful, because this is, to my mind, one of the most significant pieces of work that we've undertaken in the last 12 months, to go into a bit more detail about the carbon descent plan. Now, this is the document that was given in Appendix 2. And this significant piece of work, and I say, to my mind, fundamental piece of work to how we take this forward, is we worked with South West Energy Environment Group, who we're now partners with. We're part of their wider partnership. We worked with them at the end of 2023, having identified that the actions in the action plan, whilst very well-meaning, couldn't be quantified. We realised we needed some work around that. So they helped us out with this piece of work they're called the Carbon Descent Plan. And the Carbon Descent Plan is effectively a theoretical roadmap of how we can reduce our carbon emissions over time. And following on from that work, we then had individual meetings with all services in March 2024, where we went through the findings of that particular piece of work, worked with them in terms of how we can actually take this forward, resulting in the report that you see in Appendix 2, which sort of sets out our potential roadmap towards carbon neutrality. And I think, to me, this is the piece of work that will help us deliver the next steps, the new strategy and the updated action plan. Technically, it won't be next because it's till 2040 at the minute. So the descent plan findings, well, if we take the projections to 2040-41, based on agreed measures and initiatives that came out of the meetings with the services, combined with wider factors such as the decarbonisation electricity grid, we're going to potentially see a 74% reduction from 2022 figures to 5,800. Now, what that does say is that there's still going to be, in 2040, some carbon in the system. So obviously that's a difficulty in terms of going towards carbon neutrality. And we need to think about how we want to deal with that. Much of the reduction in the emissions due to measures implemented across social housing stock. So social housing, as you know, 40% of our emissions at the moment, social housing, is going to be a massive piece of work to work that through in terms of delivering on that area. Interestingly, as I understand it, in terms of timing, this morning, a number of you will have been at a meeting where the scale of the changes that are required within our social housing were discussed. That is, from our point of view, indicative of the sort of work that we're going to need to be carrying out to quantify how we actually achieve our carbon reductions. Rather than saying we're going to do nice actions, we're actually going to say we're going to reduce the carbon by this. And we know if we put an air source heat pump in a property, it'll reduce it by that. If you put new windows in, it'll reduce it by whatever. And we'll actually have that level of data that when we report back to you, rather than saying we've achieved a target, what we've achieved an action, we'll actually be able to say, this is how much carbon we've reduced. This will be a significant piece of work, but that's our aim. We want to become smarter. Decarbonisation of corporate buildings and leisure centres can play a role as well, as do emissions from owned vehicles. So, we know whilst they are a significant level below in terms of amounts, there's still a significant amount of carbon produced. And as I mentioned a little bit later on, we've already made some good steps forward in some of those areas, with obviously more work to do, but we've got some really nice examples of things that we can do, and we can also give some figures about, which is quite significant. So in contrast, some other areas see less change for emission with leased out buildings, and that mainly reflects maybe we've got less in terms of understanding of where we're going to be in terms of the interventions. So that's maybe a piece of work that we do need to take forwards. And what that last figure says about it'll be responsible for 18% of total emissions rather than 6% is basically because everything else comes down as a percentage they go up. So it's not saying that the emissions actually go up themselves, usually they make up a bigger percentage of the overall. So that's something we do need to look at in terms of our ongoing action plan. And I think one of the things that we will want to do going forwards is to make sure that we're not looking shorter term with the strategy. It's actually looking at over the period. So where we're introducing interventions and actions, it's not necessarily looking at the year or 2 years, or whatever. It's looking over the period and how we cycle those in to fit around other things. So yes, so picked up some of these already. Housing and tenancy, so sharp decline emissions would be due to insulation and air source heat pumps, as assumed. We know there's a gradual transition away from gas and oil into those sort of areas. Street scene, there'll be an assumption of move to EVs, which you know they're already doing. Interesting there, that was one of the things that came out of discussion when we talk about cycles of products, is that, for instance, we know that because you don't just replace a vehicle just because of the sake of it, you do it when it's ready to go. So we know that come 2036, 36, 37, the fleet will be due for a replacement, at which point we can bring in lower emissions, so you'll see a commensurate drop. So it might flatline for a bit, but then we know, because we built it in, it'll drop at that point. So it's not necessarily saying we have the reduction now, although we do want to do as much as we can short term, but at least knowing when we'll see the reduction. So it's, again, that knowledge of our planning. Place assets and commercialisation, so experiences reduced emissions from corporate buildings and leisure centres over the period, as you know, as we do transition away from carbon emitting sources of energy. But as I say, the leased out buildings is an area we do need to look at. All the services, the actual emissions from the services themselves are likely to be less significant, although, you know, still a bit like the point that was made earlier on. Things like we can still do what we can to reduce our individual carbon emissions, but they will be far more affected by scope 3. So that scope 3 is anything that's procured, it's bought in services, and we need to consider how we're going to take that forward in terms of not only measuring, but also making sure that we are utilising, lower carbon suppliers wherever possible, making sure that we're looking at the projects that we deliver to ensure that they don't actually, they don't cause more carbon emissions than necessary. And I think this is one thing that will be a potential difficult discussion at some point in the future. I think we've always said that we don't want to do offsetting, because obviously that feels like a cop-out. But in reality, it's something that we may need to consider in due course. Having said that, I think it would be self-defeating to look at that too soon, because I think otherwise we'll just buy our way out of it. And I don't think that's what's required. So, and obviously, if that's an area that we need to look at later, we can do. But at the moment, the focus should be on reducing carbon emissions. This here is, again, another one of these very difficult graphs to read, but ultimately it shows the theoretical descent if we implement the measures that are suggested by the carbon descent plan. Interestingly, you'll note there's a little uptick between last year and, the year before and this year. And that's mainly through the procurement stuff, which is what we've already said. So it was actually predicted by the descent plan, which was interesting. But realistically, you can see that we can make huge strides from where we are if we're able to implement these measures. Like I say, it will leave a residual amount as it stands at the moment. I think we've also got to bear in mind technology changes, different measures may come available, so we don't know 100%. But as it stands at the moment, there will be a residual amount that we do need to consider going forwards, 15 years hence. I thought it'd be useful to just pick out, I went through this, because you've got a big long list in towards the end of the doc, I can't remember if it's 4 or 5, where some of the things that we have achieved. I think it is telling that a lot of the achievements maybe sit outside the actions, which obviously I think reflects the fact that we do need to update our action plan. Some of the ones that we've done, and I'm sure that Catherine can add some additional detail to this once we finish the presentation, is we've seen a large increase in community engagement work, community resilience. So both Catherine and also my colleague David Whelan, who covers the emergency planning business continuity work, they've been working with parishes and towns in terms of emergency plans. So they've got 25 plans created so far, with another 15 being developed, part of a wider network. And I think this is it. We tend to focus on the carbon emissions, but there's also a mitigation element, adaptation element, beg pardon, getting mixed up. So we not only have to mitigate to reduce the amount of carbon we produce and try and help towards reducing climate change, but also we need to accept that climate change is happening. We only got to witness what happened in Spain recently. I think most people would agree that that's to some extent caused by climate change. We've only got to see what happened last year with the floods that we experienced. So acute in our area, so acute that they didn't really affect anyone outside of East Devon. So we've worked quite closely with some of our local parishes and towns to try and make sure we have action plans in place for those. Street scene have been working really hard, which is interesting, and it's something we need to keep an eye on. Street scene have been working very hard to introduce EVs to replace their combustion engine vehicles. 33% of the fleet is currently EV, and it's due to be 44% by December, but I had an update the other day, they're hoping it's 50% this year. So that's a massive step forward, and I think they are really leading by example in the street scene. We've been doing some internal training on carbon literacy, and I know some of the members around the table here today will have been on that course, and I hope they found it really useful. Catherine's got us accredited to deliver that training, and Catherine's actually now offering the training out to some of our parish and town councils. Just started that process now, trying to bring on that community engagement, trying to help them. So obviously only 2 people doing it at the minute, so it's a bit tricky to offer it out to everyone, but we are planning to get that rolled out as an ongoing piece of work. The green team has been ongoing for some time, as you know. I will mention the green team in a little bit. That's been really useful in terms of delivering good communications, good partnership work between different services. We've had some budget that we're able to look at grants and that things for. There are some other weaknesses in the green team as well, which I'll mention in a bit, but overall it's been really useful in terms of building teamwork across the different services, trying to make sure we don't go down the silo route. I thought this was a really interesting one. Car parks, and again, starting to get that point where we are starting to deliver some of these figures that we need in order to quantify our progress. Between May 23 and August 24, electric vehicle charging points in 7 East Devon District District Council car parks, were used on 3,300 separate occasions, drawing 62,000 kilowatts of electric. So significant amount of increase. And if you look at it over the year, you can see how particularly tourists are using it in the summer, and we are quite a high level user compared to other districts within the area. So yeah, it's quite a significant step forward from where we were from a few years ago into providing electric charging for cars. There's been an interesting piece of work recently in place asset and commercialisation. We're able to bring down the energy consumption of Blackdown House just by reviewing how we utilise the heating and ventilation. So post-COVID, where COVID required ventilation at all times, we were able to bring down the energy usage on that by not having it on overnight, things like that. You see, you're contributing to a better climate for us all by not having the aircon on. Another one that they've also done, which I think they're particularly proud of, is a new water circulation system, a water quality monitoring system in the pools. So the new savings were saving 50% of the energy used in usually running the pumps, carbon saving of 27 tonnes. Streets in, again, number of recovery sites have gone from 0 to 89 over the period of the action plan. Social housing, and this may well explain, and again, the frustration is we can't directly attribute it, but you can only hope that we use social housing decarbonisation funding to decarbonise 400 properties, which would partly explain the 2,000 tonne reduction in the social housing carbon emissions that we saw between 21 and 23, if I remember right. Economic development, they recently did a project where they took some funding, both, I can't remember where the external one came from, but certainly the Green Team approved and Cabinet approved £100,000 from the climate change budget to support this work for various community and business grants to carry out carbon surveys and reduction plans. And they're looking at potentially saving 103 tonnes of carbon out in the wider business and charitable community. And also they've had 18 successful applicants for the grant scheme. I don't know what IRF stands for, I beg your pardon. And 2 carbon reduction targets. So again, 4 tonnes of carbon saving there. We've also worked in environmental revenue and benefits about the economic viability model. We had a fund that was allocated for this work. This one's an interesting one in as much as it shows sometimes, whilst you can look at the big picture stuff, there are also good examples of real life benefits. So a small grant of £8,000, relatively small, £8,000 was offered out to this particular property. It was able to take it from an EPC G rating to an estimated A rating, which is a massive improvement in its energy efficiency. But it also had wider impacts. It wasn't just about the impact on climate change. It also allowed the applicant to access other grants and also support and reduce the likelihood of hospital admission. The property was in really bad condition. They had health issues, if I remember rightly. It's not only about the climate change element, it's also about the quality of life and the impact you can have on that. And it's good to bring those two different aspects together. Countryside and Wildest Devon, 70 education sessions delivered each year, encouraging a lifelong love of the natural world, getting them early young, trying to enthuse and empower our younger people to come through and actually look after the climate as we move on. They also secured funding through the Green Tea to support the Exmouth Festival in exploring carbon footprint, decarbonise the impact of the festival. This is an interesting piece of work where they wanted to look at how they could reduce the amount of carbon that the Exmouth Festival generated, and we funded a piece of work on the basis that a tool would be produced at the end of that we could apply to other events and actually look at it almost like a decarbonisation toolkit. So by all accounts that had worked well, and we had really good feedback from that. Streets team removed 6,000 metres squared of green spaces from regular mowing to wildlife improvement areas and tree planting in 2023. Planted over 2,000 trees and green space across the district. And finally, the last one I thought I'd mention is we recently funded a community action group project officer who started with us, not with us, but through us in September 2024. And he's working with local community groups. Already signed up 7, we identified another 17 to work within the community on sustainability issues and making sure the message is getting out into the wider community. So I think you can see that a lot has been achieved if you look at individual actions. And I think, if you look back at the action plan, the original action plan, we've achieved a chunk of the actions in there. 2/3, I think we can say we've achieved to a greater extent. And then there's another 23% that we need to do more work on, but have had some work going forwards. But we have to accept that, and the knock on the corollary is that carbon reduction has been inconsistent. So we have an action plan that's generally being followed, but it hasn't really had the necessary impact that we wanted on the actual carbon itself. So we do need to have a look at what we're doing in terms of the action plan. I think the action plan was the very first time that we'd sort of introduced something like that. As I understand it, it was before my time. So it was clearly a step forward. But what we think was it wasn't quantified before it was produced, and that made it very difficult to give you, as members, a definitive sort of answer as to whether what we're achieving is actually being effective. We didn't set smart targets, smart, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time-bounded. So the work we see at SWIG in 2023 and the ongoing work around the descent plan, to me, is fundamental in actually getting over this and actually giving you something that not only delivers, but actually we can show you, we can give you evidence to support that. And that's where we're really focusing our efforts on at the minute. The Green Team was designed to give a corporate oversight of climate change, and it comprising senior officers of all services. And it has been successful in bringing together those services, but it does mean it's quite informal. So it does make accountability quite difficult, and it's something that we're sort of reviewing as to how best we can achieve that. And one of the things that we have agreed in, it hasn't been absolutely approved yet, but it has been agreed at high level, is that we're going to have a climate change manager post. And that will hopefully bring in a stronger link between the strategic and operational work. So actually making sure that we have the opportunity to actually go into different services at the right level and make sure that we are keeping people accountable for delivering on their part of the action plan. And I have to say, in our work with the different services, everyone's very open to work together. It's trying to make sure it's embedded throughout the organisation in the day job and not seen as extra. So our conclusions, overall we have made solid progress in delivering on the actions specified in the action plan, but it does seem that it is very inconsistent in terms of actual carbon reduction. So we know that COVID-19 had a knock-on effect because all of a sudden you took out a lot of carbon that we would normally be utilising, and then it bounced back again afterwards. So it's been quite hard to quantify, but we didn't actually quantify the original action plan, and that means it's quite difficult to give you a definitive answer. So having identified this, we worked this week to produce the descent plan and make sure that any future actions that we come up with are properly quantified and also budgeted for as well, which I think is really important, that we have an understanding of how these actions will actually be delivered, and make sure they've got appropriate oversight. And as I said, the previous action plan was a significant step forward in demonstrating the council's commitment to moving to net zero, but we will need to be smarter and learn from the previous action plan. We generally do feel that the learnings that we have got from this and the review that we're carrying out at the moment is going to help us come up with something much better for the next 5-year period. And I think the fact that we're now doing annual reviews to Scrutiny, that'll keep us on our toes to make sure that we're keeping reporting back. And I think what we'd really appreciate from you is the recommendations in the report is that you note the progress and also the difficulties as well, to be fair, in achieving the action plan, but also having heard some of the issues, maybe read the report, looked at the appendices, are there areas that you feel we can take forward more effectively to actually deliver a better, smarter, more quantified action plan going forwards? So I hope it's helped. Just before I finish, Chair, if it's okay, I did have a couple of contacts direct from members. Is it all right just to mention those? Okay, so Councillor Fernley, she mentioned again about the travel to BDH by car and the carbon dioxide impact from doing that. Councillor Wibley asked a couple of questions. One was about procurement. I think we've answered that in. It is quite high level. It's based on spend at the moment. We know we can do more around that, both in terms of how we measure it and collect that data, but also what we do to reduce it. So we know there's definitely a piece of work there that we can definitely work on. And the other thing that Councillor Wibley requested was whether or not there'll be an opportunity for members to work with SWIG, and the answer to that is absolutely. So we have been working on a draft new strategy. We would very much welcome the opportunity, and we need to make sure SWIG have to do this, but they generally are, to ask them to come in and support some work with members in some sort of workshop going forwards, if we can organise that, to discuss next steps on what we can do realistically, and how we build that into the strategy and the action plan. So yeah, we very much would like to do that if we can organise it. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right. It's quite a lot to take in. You've had the detailed papers. I'll just open out to outside first. Peter.
So, well, particularly our housing stock, but anything else we've got like that, how do you establish the carbon footprint? Do we know anything about what energy the residents are using and who their providers are, whether they're green electricity or anything like that? Or what is the figures based on?
Councillor Faithful, hello. So we use SWIG, sorry, thank you. SWIG use some, we provide them with a lot of data on our housing stock, so EPC details where we've got it. We also provide them with details of our housing stock. They've had access to the database that we've used for the stock condition survey, and we don't collect any details on how our residents use energy within the properties. This is relatively high level, and it's based on standard assumptions that are used across the industry, and all other councils which have to make this sort of estimations will use a similar data, and probably other social housing providers will use this as similar. So we make assumptions based on energy use, based on size and age of building.
So basically, this is an estimate. It's not there's no clear, accurate detail.
That's right. We've got sort of 4,500 properties, and we don't have any kind of monitoring. We don't ask for bill data or anything like that from our tenants. There is standard industry standard data that's provided, which works on the age of the property, and that's the data that SWIG are able to access.
Thank you, Chair. So just a couple of questions. Firstly, on the procurement figures, which the emissions, obviously, they show significant increase over the latter 3 years. You said the way of measuring it is quite a blunt tool because obviously it's just based on the value of the goods and services that are procured. So I was just interested to understand how inflation is accounted for within those figures, because obviously during that period inflation was running quite high at sort of 10%. So does that then have an impact on the emissions? Because ultimately if you're buying something that emits a certain amount of emissions, the emissions don't change if it's just gone up in price, for example. So that was my first question. And the second question is around the amount of green open space that we own ourselves as an authority. So we've got lots of open spaces, nature reserves, etc., etc. Obviously, we can use those to calculate emissions ourselves in terms of the reduction, but could we potentially sell credits to other organisations and use that income to further improve our own position? So that's just two questions. Thank you.
So for the first question, I don't actually have a definite answer, but I think, and I can double check, that they take into account inflation, so that they adjust it for inflation, because they use the greenhouse gas protocol in order to appoint spend, because concrete is different from pens. So looking at spend categories, and they look to do that. In relation to the second one, woodland credits, this is something that we've looked at very briefly previously, looking at is this going to be a possible thing to do. It's relatively complex, as you can imagine. It involves tying land up for at least 30 odd years, because it actually takes quite a while before that credit is worth anything, because the amount of carbon sequestered by a very small tree is much different from a larger tree, and it is something that we have explored. It's the cost involved in setting something like this up and setting aside that land, but absolutely this is something that could be explored further, and I know that some work has been done on this previously, and maybe I could get access to that for you.
Vicky.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for bringing this report to us. I've got a couple of questions. Firstly, on the housing, where it says social housing decarbonisation funding used to decarbonise 400 properties, how were those 400 properties out of our 4,500 properties chosen? The second question being, what exactly do you mean by they were decarbonised? What exactly was done to those properties? And then I have got another question, but it's on something else, so I'll let you answer those ones first. Thank you.
Hiya. So with the decarbonisation of property, social housing decarbonisation fund, they tended to use the worst first. So we looked at fabric first improvements, and we looked at some of the worst performing properties. So never ones with things like gas central heating, but more solid fuel properties, and the ones which are more difficult and costly to fix. Could you please repeat your question for me? I missed half of it, sorry.
Thank you. The other question was, what do you mean by decarbonisation? What exactly did you do to these properties?
There was a mix of technologies that were used in the properties. So air source heat pumps were installed in a number of properties, solar panels, additional insulation, windows, and general draft proofing and door replacement and things like that. But it was a range of technologies that were used as a result of a survey on the property.
Thank you. Can I come back to you for a second? Thank you. So I've actually had an email from a resident, and I will contact you at a later date, because they've had a follow-up email from them today, from a resident who lives in, I won't say the address or anything, but basically lives in sheltered accommodation. There's about 8 of them altogether. They're all exactly the same, is my understanding. For some reason, they were all promised they would get new roofs and insulation in the walls. 3 of them are being refused the insulation in the walls, and they have no idea why. All the other properties have had it. They've got no idea why. That's why I asked the question how they were chosen. I'm also aware of somebody who lives in one of our properties who has an air source heat pump fitted. They're semi-detached. The one that they're semi-detached to is exactly the same, but the mirror image of. The one I'm referring to has got air source heat pump and solar panels. The other one's got nothing. And that's why I'm curious as to how these have been picked. They're exactly the same properties, but mirror images of each other. So I'm just curious as to how this is working. Thank you. Sorry, and I know that's a very specific thing, but that's why I asked the question. But I will send you an email confidentially about this. Thank you.
Ollie?
Thank you. I've got 4 questions, actually. I was pleased to see there was some outreach work going on, particularly through Street Scene and the Countryside team. I wonder if we could be doing a bit more on giving energy advice, insulation, draft proofing, which you mentioned, etc. Second question, as measurement, I would hope, becomes more sophisticated, for instance, on procurement, instead of the blunt tool we're using at the moment of simply saying how much do you spend, that equates to, will this make it hard to compare year on year in order to track progress? If we keep moving the goalposts, is this going to make it difficult to know if we're succeeding? A couple of other questions. The graph sort of fell off a cliff at 2040, and I'm wondering if we could assume that those reductions would continue, or whether we will kind of have reached stasis there where we simply cannot reduce it anymore, and would that be the point at which to consider offsetting? And finally, are we going to provide some more EV charging here at Blackdown House, and other plans to introduce more EV charging in our car parks? Because I think it's quite notable that of the ones we've fitted, and the Exmouth ones have only just come online, to see how many vehicles were actually charged up in that time. I think that's quite significant.
Good evening, Councillor Davey. So I'm going to start. I made a bit of a list, so just bear with me if I miss the point. So when it comes to insulation advice, our private sector housing team do a great deal of work with that. They do outreach days. We also work extensively with Exeter Community Energy, who we make referrals to through our through funded schemes, through Hugs and Lads, and as does our financial resilience team through Revs and Benefits. So we do offer advice. There's information on our website about Exeter Community Energy, and we do share events that they have. They do community events where you can go and get energy advice. Sidmouth, for example, we shared that. They had one the other week. So we are doing some. There's always room for more, and we absolutely look to support our partners at Exeter Community Energy. With procurement, I'm going to have to ask you if you could please repeat your question, because I'm not sure I grasped the nub of it.
Yeah, it was just that in order to calculate our emissions at the moment through procurement, we're simply using a rather blunt tool of how much we spend. I'm assuming that we will in the future have more sophisticated ways of getting more accurate figures for how much procurement is actually producing in terms of carbon emissions as we get better data from our suppliers and so on. And is that going to make it difficult then to compare year on year, because we will be kind of constantly moving the goalposts?
I think it'll go into our overall carbon footprint, and instead of just having an allocated for procurement, we will be able to. I won't be able to, but the very clever people we work with at SWEG will be able to differentiate so that we can make sure that we are able to compare apples with apples as we go along, because this needs to be, the data needs to be credible. And with the procurement, we need better quality data, and we need the kind of our suppliers to catch up with us at the moment, because it's very hard. They often don't have the resources and knowledge and to provide us this data at the time. It's coming. It's sort of trickling down as these things do. There's some of the very big companies are doing carbon reporting as part of their financial reporting. These things just take a while to come down to some of the smaller scale suppliers we support. So number 3 was, yes, the graph stopped at 2040 because that was our net zero date. And as you can see, we had 5,000 tonnes of carbon. We will absolutely probably have to look at some form of offset. As you're well aware, not only do we need to potentially offset, but we also need to sequester carbon from the atmosphere. You know, we're at 422 parts per million at the moment. So as well as turning the tap off, we need to empty the bathtub, to use that analogy, don't we? So absolutely there will be stuff there. I say let's get the first 50% done and then we can worry about how we'll do the last 50%. But absolutely that's something we're going to need to consider. With Blackdown House, vehicle charging here, we agreed through our green team that there was going to be some funding in order to allow additional chargers to come in here. And we're working with, through Devon County Council, through a scheme called the Levi scheme. And Richard Easthope, our car parks manager, is very heavily involved in this, where we're looking to bring a second phase of EV charging into our car parks. But this is mainly going to have a focus on residential EV charging for residents who do not have access to a private driveway. So this is going to be on-road parking, because about 40% of properties in Devon don't have their own driveway. So we need to be able to support our residents to access charging there. It's much cheaper to do it this way than sort of through commercial rates, you know, in a car park. So this is enabling residents to charge near their properties.
Ian. Thank you, Chair. So I've got several questions. Not just questions, I suppose. There are more points. 400 social houses we've decarbonised. Is that correct? I mean, so we were told the cost for decarbonising a house in the HRB is 21,000 on average, which means we've spent £8 million so far on doing that. What are we hoping on decarbonising a house? So I presume this is mainly heating costs, etc. What sort of carbon saving are we getting? And are we expecting to spend £21,000 on average on the other 4,000 homes, another £86 million to get down to that? Obviously, that's a huge amount of money. But again, I'm always going back to the cost per tonne of carbon we save. What does it cost us? And is it efficient? Are we spending our money best to get the best return for the best amount of carbon saved with the money we're putting in? Now, I went on carbon literacy training, and one of the things they were saying is that the amount we spend now in carbon and embed the carbon, that's really bad carbon because that's here and now, whereas things we're saving is important. We've got to do that, but we need to make sure we're not spending more carbon now to save less in the future, I think was my understanding of it. I probably got that wrong. So that's the first thing on the houses that I was just concerned about. On this scope 1, 2 and 3, obviously scope 3 will, as you say, follow on, and that's something that is outside our control at the present time. We can insist that they get better, but we should be concentrating on scope 1 and 2. We can measure that, it's easier to measure. And then you presume other companies are going through the same thing we are. Everyone's got to get down to this net zero, or carbon neutral. So on the leased out buildings, we do lots of leases for buildings, and we also have our social houses. On any building that we decarbonise, are we insisting that the electric is then bought through a green tariff? So, you know, we're spending all this money, we're saving the people that are living in these houses huge amounts of money because it's cheaper to run. Are we then insisting that they buy through Octopus Energy or someone, others are available, I'm sure, green energy, so that we know and we can then measure that. And the same with any new leases that we have, commercial leases or any other leases, they should all buy through green energy. It shouldn't be a choice, it should be something that we can easily insist on, and it's just part of the lease. If you don't like it, don't take the lease. I was just fascinated, you said that £8,000 was given to take a house from G to A and yet it costs us £21,000. Okay, I'm sure you can, right. So maybe they're getting other grants that are adding to that, right, okay. So again, is that something that we should be taking more advantage of going forward? We talk about talking about this more and putting in managers or hiring extra people to talk about this. I've asked the portfolio holder for this, if we could have a portfolio teams. This is something that needs debate and needs talking about, and ideas that are, this is something new. No one knows exactly what we're doing and how we're doing it. There isn't a blueprint we can look back over 10, 20 years and say, oh, this is what you're supposed to do, this council has done it. If we had a portfolio teams where more members are involved that can come and have debates and talk about stupid things that maybe are stupid, that can just be told, no, that doesn't work because, but there might be ideas that come out of that. And I just think that talking about these things and getting a debate going on these things between not only officers, but also members that can then spread it down to their local groups would be helpful. But again, there seems to be this huge thing of not wanting any other involvement outside of official groups like this, which is very short time to talk. You don't have time to debate for a period of time on just one topic, although I know we are tonight. But we don't have enough time to do that. And I don't know why it is that there is this fear of getting people involved to just talk. They don't make decisions. There's nothing involved in them other than a workshop to chat and to talk and to give ideas to different people that can then be built upon. And is there an average, a UK average of cost per tonne saved of carbon? So is there something in the UK that basically says, the average council's saving 10,000 tonnes and it's cost them £20,000? Because at the moment, we've got nothing to benchmark whether we're doing well. Not just the percentages we're dropping, which is great, but how much has that cost us to do that? An EV lorry costs 300 and something thousand, £150,000 more than a diesel lorry. Is that a good return? Or should we be spending that extra £150,000 on decarbonising some properties that will save us more carbon, and then in 10 years' time, when they've sorted out electric vehicles on large vehicles, we buy our vehicles then? These are questions that, again, would be great to have in a debate outside of here, where we're on limited time. So there's my points. They're not really questions.
Did you want to come back on those?
Yes, right, Councillor Barlow, which ones would you like, which were questions and which were points? I'm happy to answer all of them the best I can.
So, can we have a portfolio team?
That's something I know that you've discussed with Councillor Marion Rixon, and that's her prerogative to decide. That's something that I will leave with you and her. We did used to have climate change drop-in sessions, so I ran them for 18 months. They were available to everyone for us exactly like that, to informally discuss environmental topics. I would quite often pose a question and then people could join or not. And we had it online because it was during COVID, and I ran them for a while, and actually I stopped doing it because I ended up sitting there on my own quite often.
Yeah, I understand that, but obviously a portfolio team is something that is elected by the different parties that put people forward here, and then there is a responsibility to turn up. So again, it just makes it that little bit more formal that maybe people will turn up. So there's something that we'll put through. Other questions? The £8,000 on the house.
Matt, come in on that point.
Sorry, Councillor, just to add to what Catherine's saying, I don't think we're averse to that idea at all. We certainly would like to work with councillors around the new strategy and the action plan. As I said in the presentation, we would like to bring SWE in to come and talk to you and sort of give you, because best in the world, they're the data guys. They know that really well, and they can actually explain some of this to you better. Some of the stuff about how much cost per car, they'll probably up to it off the top of their head, whereas we can't. So yeah, we absolutely would like to work with members on this, because we think it's a council priority at the end of the day, so we want to make sure it's right, and I think we've got a good opportunity to do that, so yes.
Thank you, Matt. I think everybody would welcome that, and I think there's a lot of people very interested in climate change. Others maybe not so much, but in this council, there's a lot of people really want to get it right. They've all got different experiences and different views, and I think having a group together informally would be very helpful.
Can I just, so the other thing is, can we insist that all new leases make people have green energy? And again, especially if we're on the social housing, if we're decarbonising a house, it should be a cost of having that benefit.
Just to answer to that, Ian, I mean, I don't think legally we'd be able to enforce that people are able to do that as part of their lease. That's the problem. We can advise and we can give it as we do at the moment in terms of signposting. Whether or not that would be possible to look into from an asset base, as in a commercial asset, is a very different thing. And I would look for my colleagues in assets to be able to respond to that. Obviously, they're not here, but we can ask that question. One of the things that we do, and Catherine touched on it, one of the things that we do need to look at as part of the procurement is our expectations that we're putting on our contractors and our third-party suppliers and everybody really to kind of up their game in terms of carbon efficiency. So that's all tied up in that procurement piece. I just think from a legal perspective, we'd be in a very difficult position to enforce any tenant to take on any particular energy choice. And I certainly wouldn't be comfortable with that. We can advise and we can say why we're advising it. Yeah, I think it would be a bit of a tricky situation for us, I think.
Don't decarbonise their houses then. Move on to something that will.
I don't think we can refuse people heating and warmth on the basis that they should supply their energy from a certain supplier. I think we would find ourselves in a sticky predicament. However, it is important to note that if people are looking at certain technologies, it may only be certain providers that do provide the support for those certain measures. So it would all totally depend on whatever measures were introduced.
Duncan?
Okay. Well, thank you for a very detailed report. And I think as all the members here would second that this is really important and we need to get into the detail. And there's a lot more detail, and I think we will get there once we get to these SMART goals, because as you've pointed out, a lot of these measures weren't really quantified to start with, so it's really hard to understand how we're going. Coming back to that discussion about forcing people to have green energy, and I entirely take your point that we can't be forcing our tenants to take a particular supply, and if we did and they had a technical problem with that supplier, we'd be on the hook to, well, you forced me to use this. However, we might be able to encourage, and again, I took Catherine's point that we don't ask for their bills to know what the impact of the work was, but I'm assuming that we might well do some sort of survey of houses we've worked on to work out how efficient it was. Did this work? And you might encourage them, if you'd like to tell us, has this improved your energy bills or reduced them, then let us know. And obviously, if we can give some advice while they're doing that, look, you know, our current survey of the market right now says there are these deals around which look to be, you know, you can compare what, we don't know what you've got, compare them with what you're doing. And also our other tenants have already told us that they're getting a 5% reduction in their bill or whatever it might be. That will help. I'm slightly concerned by the term decarbonise. I know it's the jargon, but when we say, to Councillor Barlow's point, we've decarbonised a house, we haven't really taken that carbon down to zero, we've just reduced it. So we have to be a bit careful how we use the language, and that's where we get to this thing that at the end of our period, we've still got carbon that we cannot take out. So I think we just have to be a little bit careful. We're not promising the moon to people. Another point that I think you will come to as you work on these SMART goals, and we've heard about the procurement is by spend at the moment, not by type. One of the things, and you mentioned when you said procurement, those two words, seawall, which to me means massive amounts of concrete, which is one of the most carbon intensive materials we know about. As we stratify our procurement into we're buying pencils or, you know, cardboard boxes or concrete, even if we don't know from the supplier what the carbon intensity was, at least we can have a general idea that this is carbon, this is expensive. And I was wondering if that was in part to do with the, one of the reasons why we're seeing this procurement spend going up, because there's been a massive amount of work on seawalls of late, and that must have included a lot of carbon intensive materials and carbon intensive vehicles to move all that stuff around to actually do the construction. Is that something that we can kind of monitor? At least we can, even if we can't get the suppliers to tell us, at least we can break down to that level.
And I think the engineers are doing quite a lot of work to try and quantify this where they can. And it's something that I'd have to go back and check with them. But I know that this is something that they're looking into.
If I could make one other point as well, that I know Matt, you mentioned that offsetting is not really the thing, and we will end up doing it in the end. But there were quite a few of those goals which were about resilience work and changing the way we manage green spaces, planting trees. Now, those things will have an impact on carbon, and are we getting the benefit, even if we're not able to sell those carbon credits? And I understand why that might be difficult. At least we can get the credit for, well, actually, these landscape changes that we've made have reduced carbon, or by sequestering carbon at a certain rate, and we can at least give ourselves some benefit in our plans, even if we're not taking money out of other people for selling them a credit.
I think it's quite a hard calculation. It's something we've discussed this week, and actually trees are far more valuable than just carbon. You know, we need to think in terms of shading, of habitat, of community space, of land stabilisation, and all the other things that you're fully aware of. So potentially it's a thing. I mean, I'm not sure how many trees we've planted, sort of 2,000 over a couple of years. That's great. We obviously we have plans to increase the tree canopy cover, but I'm not sure if we've quantified the impact that that's going to have, what carbon we expect, because obviously there's lots of things that we can't take into account, the rate, the number that actually reach full maturity and things like that. We'll be making some quite sort of broad assumptions if we weren't careful. But it's absolutely something we could explore further, and I can speak to my colleagues this week and see what details they have. Thank you.
Matt.
Thank you, Chair. A number of questions. Firstly, going back to the comments made by Councillor Wibley at the start, I think one of the problems that we've got is if you look at the table on page 42, obviously we've got employee commuting as a specific title, but we don't have councillor involvement in that. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed, because, you know, there are very few days of a working week that there aren't councillors here. And I think that needs to be taken more into consideration. I think the other point as well is it's great to see the figure, for example, that over 2,000 trees have been planted. But actually, I think the figure we need to know is how much our tree canopy is growing by. Because for all we know, we've planted 2,200 trees, but we've lost 2,500. We don't know that. And that's the type of figures I think we need to know, particularly when it comes to the living environment. And I think finally, I was very pleased to hear that sort of offsetting is not our lead goal at the moment, because to be honest with you, it certainly appears to myself, other councillors and some residents that the council hasn't done quite enough yet to deal with the low-hanging fruit. I've lost track of the amount of times that people have commented that this building is lit up like a Christmas tree when you go past of an early evening, or even just to the simple things like tonight, if somebody, a councillor, wants a coffee, they are opening up a tiny plastic sachet to put in the bin, and if they want milk in it, it's tiny plastic little milk cartons that are put in the bin. I think we're missing some of the easy and obvious things that we should be looking at first. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Caitlin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it was just to reiterate, really, I agree with you in terms of, and one of the points that came up when I was kind of thinking about it, so two people have made the point and it's kind of triggered in my mind, so I figured I might share my thoughts. But it is about measuring where we are protecting green space, isn't it? And it's about the work that the planning team are doing in order to ensure that we aren't building for the sake of building, that we're looking at all of those measures that we are protecting, in addition to, you know, as you say, planting new trees. Is what are we doing in order to maintain and retain our existing canopy, isn't it? and what our measures are and what our non-negotiables are within it as well as an authority. So yeah, no, I just wanted to echo that really. And just furthermore, I think it's about referencing about what language we're using. Again, thinking about things like decarb measures have taken place and, kind of steps have been taken in this area. It's about looking at our language, isn't it, and being slightly more intentional in how we pitch some of this. So yeah, I'd agree.
And I got two people who've spoken before want to come back, but you haven't spoken at all, so I'll go to you first.
Thank you, Chair. Just following on from the trees and how we can measure them, this is why a figure doesn't work. It's why with the tree strategy policy, we're looking at canopy cover, because that you can calculate easily, because they will survey every 5 years or something to get the figure in, and then you can work out the carbon reduction. Whereas otherwise, you have to go around and count every single tree, which is not feasible, and that's why we're not working with numbers. So I can see where we're going on that. Just going back to social housing and trying to help decarbon with the fact of smart meters. I don't know what our policy is for getting in smart meters into our properties, but if you do that, you can actually get the residents to use, they can use low tariffs, smart tariffs, which will help with their bills. It also, because the way those smart tariffs work, they're going to be using more green energy. So it's sort of helping the resident, but also helping us to reduce our carbon in a way which actually isn't an expense to us. So I don't know if that is ongoing or whether it could be utilised. Thank you.
So the grid is rapidly decarbonising, and we expect it to be virtually decarbonised in about the next 10, 15 years. So we've seen huge reductions already. That's where when people stand up and say how we're leading the way, it's because we've decarbonised our energy supply, gone from coal, lots of renewable energy. So all the energy going into all of our properties is decarbonising, and you'll see that in our descent plan why we've got some of the reductions we have. Smart meters are a little bit contentious because there is quite a lot of concern around them, and some people really don't like them, and Exeter Community Energy have done quite a lot of work trying to persuade people. Obviously the energy companies are trying to get people onto smart meters. It's a big government initiative, and there is still quite a lot of misinformation, fear and mistrust around them. People are concerned about what they do and are they being spied on, or automatically will they have their energy switched off and things like that. So there is absolutely a public education job there, and we do support that work through Exeter Community Energy. But I don't think we're in a position to tell people that they should definitely have it any more than just telling them what energy supply they should have.
So Marcus and Vicky, you've got one question each. If you both, I'll go to you, Maddie, first.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I understand the street scene and the countryside team are doing a great job and bringing up the subject trees. And the small forest, I know, in Exmouth is doing really, really well. It's growing fantastically. The trees planted by street scene on the outside, however, aren't. And that's because they're not being maintained properly. So I think doing all these trees, but my problem that I brought up before is with new developments that are landscaped and trees. Now the trees that are put in are young, they're not big enough for TPO, and they're only protected for 5 years. So can the council increase the protection of trees that are planted on new developments or on East Devon land and protect these trees? Because we could plant thousands and thousands, and if they're not looked after and they're not protected, what are we doing? Thank you, Chair.
And that one goes to the tree strategy, which they will be bringing back here. And I think I'm going to come in, what Anne says about the number of trees. I think there's two ways of looking at it. I'm very passionately believe number of trees is important because residents recognise that, as we've heard tonight. Recognise 2,000 people know that. If they said that tree cover has been increased by 5%, they wouldn't know what that means. But planting trees does mean something to our residents. But I understand we all got different views. So I'm now going to, the last two before I summarise, Marcus and then Vicky, if you both ask your questions, and then we'll answer your question.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm just trying to get my head around the complexities of calculating carbon. And when you said seawall, it got me thinking, knowing that we've got a scheme in place in Seaton, which is in my ward. So the lion's share of the funding is coming down from the Environment Agency to deliver that work to improve sea defences. And obviously there's going to be a large amount of concrete and industrial work that goes on, which is obviously carbon intensive. So when you, at the point that you measure the carbon, the expenditure is obviously made by us as a district council, but it's through third party funding. So is the carbon 100% apportioned to us? Or does it somehow get apportioned to another agency, shall we say? And then another thought that's just come into my head off the back of what Maddie was talking about in terms of trees and development. Is there anything in terms of when we give planning permission for a large estate of houses to be built, if we insist that a large number of trees need to be planted as part of that, if those trees are not on land owned by East Devon District Council, does that mean that the carbon can't be attributed to us? Or because we've asked for them, can we use that to offset? Because, I'm sorry, I'm opening up another can of worms here, but my brain is working in incredibly fast in terms of how do we sort of start to measure this? Because actually we're developing a local plan at the moment. So if it meant that we had to own the land that the trees are on in order to get the carbon impact from it, then can we not insist that land is handed over to us as part of planning permissions and things like that? So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
That's a good question, and I don't know about the ownership of the trees for carbon accounting. What you want to avoid is double counting, whereas the developer goes, yay, we are much more carbon neutral because we planted 5,000 trees, and us to go, yay, we've insisted on 5,000 trees being planted, so therefore, it's one of those things we will have to explore, and I really don't know the answer off the top of my head. That would be one for my colleagues in planning. Thank you.
Trees will come under EDC because it's in the area of EDC. It doesn't have to actually be on the private land or our land, so it covers the whole of it. The seawall, I've got no idea.
The seawall, I don't know is the short answer. I don't know if it's done on who's apportioned the spend. So if the Environment Agency have to take 50% of it, if they've come up with 50% of the cash, and we have to take 50% of the carbon, or if we take it all because it happened in our district. I don't know is the short answer. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Vicky.
Thank you. Mine are just two fairly quick ones. I noticed in the report you put support and enable the rollout of the Cliffs Valley Trail to provide a new multi-use trail between Killerton and Topsham. Is there any chance you could look at the Otter Trail at the same time and support that and encourage it? And the other one is, I noticed, and I bang on at this all the time at Town Council, I sit on Town Council planning, you've put encourage rainwater harvesting. Is there any way that as a district council we can enforce rainwater harvesting as part of our planning applications? Because I asked years ago, I asked Ed Freeman whether or not we can enforce back boxes, swift boxes, etc., and was told no. But I don't see how we can't when we're the planning authority. And as Ollie sat there as chair of planning, I thought now was the ideal time to ask. Thank you.
Did you want to answer that? Come back to it.
They're both items outside of, because I don't do planning. So both items outside of my particular area, so we can pick those up and ask the question. Sorry? Yeah, well, again, that's my area. So I'm one of those areas, I'm afraid, that is in the action plan. Exactly.
Thank you, Matt. Before I give the mic, I got a couple of questions for you. First of all, thank everybody for their contribution. It shows a passion that people have got in this room for climate change. And I'm delighted you brought this report to us. We've had many conversations offline, and I think it's a really good report. But I think we recognise we're a long way to go. One of the areas that's quite clear we can improve is Cabinet and Council reports. I did a summary of all the Cabinet reports for the last 9 months. 4 had medium, 2 had medium and 2 had high risk to climate change. But it didn't say what the effect was going to be. You have, Ian's brought it up tonight, about the carbon, what carbon offset, what carbon will be saved if you do X, Y, Z. But when we have reports, we get none of that from the report. And I think it could be very helpful if we had that report, but that's got to be a director's, because I think then it's them all buying into it, because let's be clear, we can talk about climate change. We can't really make a change, but we all can collectively, with businesses and government, make change. But individually, we can't, but together I think we can. I think the other thing is I am really concerned about this procurement, and it's come up several times. And it's dawned on me that what happens if you have a contract, do we, and that's going to last 3 years, do we make sure that on the 3rd year that's taken off? In other words, if it's in for year 1, 2, and 3, on the 4th year, we're not buying that stuff. Do we know we're not going to buy that stuff? You know, it's a very complicated, it's so complicated.
So we get that data from our accounts function, so it just won't be there in the 4th year. So
Right, so it's what is actually net spent
yes,
each year.
Yes, it's what's spent. So we get the data in arrears. So we do that, and then we calculate that data. One of the things that we're looking at, you're absolutely right about the decision making. You know, how do we do that in a way that, and there's lots of ways of doing that, and the decision wheel is one of them. It's got lots of different names. It's basically a tool for evaluating it, and it's something that we are looking into, and potentially when our climate change manager comes, that they'll probably want to do something like this. I don't know. It's something we have to discuss with everyone and find a way that's going to work for everyone. We're trying to do this without giving everyone yet another job to do on top of their already busy workloads. But we need to ensure that we are fully aware of the consequences of the decisions we're making.
And I don't underestimate the amount of money that, and we've discussed it tonight, how much some of these things will cost if we're going to decarbonise, etc. It's a lot of money. It's whether or not where that money is going to come from. We've got to make that decision. We've got to be mindful of that when we go into the new strategy, which will be probably 2025 with a bit of luck. That how much will that actually cost? Because when you look back to the cabinet reports in 2020, in 2022, it was quoting numbers, but they didn't really know what it was going to cost. And I think we're in a better position now to know. So let's finish that. Thank you very much for coming, both of you, tonight. And we got 2 recommendations that Scrutiny note the progress made in achieving the actions specified in the Climate Action Plan 2020 to 2040, and Scrutiny Committee consider the lessons learned and how they can be applied to the development of the next Climate Change Action Plan. Did you want to say?
Please. Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was just going to make one small request. Given that there's been so much interest in this, I've still got lots of questions. Yes. Is it okay if we were to email you with some specific questions? There are probably ideas that already occurred to you. Well, don't worry, we've got that. Or, hey, that's new. I'll follow that up. Thank you.
Chair, also, could we request then from the portfolio holder that they look at the portfolio team so that we can have more chats? I know it's a similar thing, but again, it's just making sure that it's done. And are we making any other recommendations to?
Well, I think we've agreed with Matt and the team that you would like people to come and help with it, and we could make that as a recommendation from here that members are included in helping you formulate the strategy going forward. I think that would be a good recommendation.
And I presume the strategy will be coming to overview at some point soon.
That's where it's got to come, isn't it?
Thank you.
Yeah, and it shouldn't. I don't think we're talking about a team just from Scrutiny. We're talking about members from across the council, aren't we? Yes, Matt.
Yeah, just say absolutely. But obviously, before we get to that point, we need to put it through members and officers and make sure that we've properly consulted on it before we pass it over to overview. So we want to make sure absolutely include overview in that. But I think there's steps to go before we get there. So just to confirm as well, we would like to bring Swig in to talk to members and actually go through some of the technical details, because best in the world, they know that stuff backwards, forwards, sideways, and we don't, and they can really help with that.
Put it in the recommendation.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Kathleen, for coming tonight. I really appreciate that. Right, so... Oh, should we better... Should we vote? We've got to vote, haven't we? Should we vote on that? All those... Yeah, we're voting for the two recommendations, and then the third one was going to be...
So the two recommendations as in the papers, members, and then an additional one that is that members request that members are included in considering the strategy going forward, and then the additional wording that, which I think officers have in hand anyway, that SWIG will be brought in to provide some more technical input and technical expertise to members. So that's where they are.
Yep.
Proposed from the chair.
Yep, I propose that. Any seconder for that?
Don't need it.
We don't need
Just
it.
you.
Oh, so,
Just you on your
right,
own,
all
Chair.
those in favour? Right, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, so moving on to agenda item nine, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, which is a progress update on the action plan for members' training on scrutiny.
Thank you, Chair. So the Democratic Services Manager has provided an update for you members on the 8 recommendations that were in the Scrutiny Action Plan. So recommendation 1, to review the terms of reference. The Chairs and Vice Chairs have met to discuss and review the terms of reference. The frequency of meetings, the preferred option is 4 meetings per year, with other scrutiny work being carried out on Teams, for example, TAFs or scrutiny briefings. The government has issued a consultation paper on hybrid meetings to make changes to the 1972 Local Government Act to give councils greater flexibility around how meetings are conducted, so in person, in the chamber or hybrid. The membership of the Overview Committee and the Scrutiny Committee, the suggestion is that these be aligned to 13 councillors, and the Housing Review Board has recently been reviewed and has increased its membership from 5 to 7. And finally, on revised terms of reference, these will be fed into the Constitution Working Group, that group's programme of work. So on recommendation 2 in the Scrutiny Action Plan, which is resources for overview and scrutiny, a draft job description has been prepared for scrutiny officer, and this is now subject to a job evaluation process. It's hoped to be advertised in January next year. Recommendation 3, which is senior officer support. So this is already in place, and Andy Wood, the director for Place, is now supporting the Scrutiny Committee, Catherine Stark supporting HRB, and Simon Davies supporting Overview Committee. Recommendation 4 of the action plan, which is training and development. The Centre for Governance and Scrutiny will be delivering a training session for all 3 scrutiny committees on the 28th of November on Teams. There's further training and development to be identified through a member skills audit, and the member development working group have already started on this work. Recommendation 5, which is prioritising work programming. The chairs and the vice chairs will meet quarterly to review work programmes of each committee, and these will include better links to the Audit and Governance Committee. Recommendation 6, which was about cross-party pre-meetings. These will be arranged as and when they're required before committee meetings. Recommendation 7, which was on development of support. There'll be training for officers, which will be provided in January 2025. Recommendation 8, which was about having an impact and the actions and outcomes to be tracked. There is a new performance management system which has now been procured. And regular updates on overview and scrutiny work will also be included in the councillor newsletter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Any questions to Sarah or Self on that? That's the update. Yes, sir.
Because the pack wasn't easily available, not everyone's seen sight of this, I don't think. Because I've got it actually under my calendar bits. It's not in the proper,
Sorry, you're talking about,
what you're just going through,
yeah, but this is a verbal update.
verbal update,
Yeah.
beg puds. There's a lot to take in because I've got some of the,
I think,
yeah.
I think it's a fair point. I think what I'd do is, Sarah, if Andrew could, if we could circulate it to members, I think it's a very fair point. Vicky?
Could I just ask, we were told that I could be completely wrong, the 28th of November, you said that there's a training. Any idea what time of day or evening or?
This evening.
Everybody's got a calendar appointment and the Teams link. I sent that round this week and you've had the calendar appointment for a few weeks, so you should. If you haven't got it, I'll resend
No,
it.
no, it's here. It's just I've been a bit manic at work recently, so I've not had a chance to see it. Thank you.
And I think. It's online. And it will be recorded for people that aren't able to attend. And really, that will give us an opportunity to also look at the forward plan there, because we're going to go over, as an exercise, all the things that we've done over the course of last year, things we perhaps haven't done and things we have done, and as an exercise, and then pick out some of the key points from that we want to pick up going forward. Okay, but we will issue that with the minutes. So agenda item 10, the work programme, so that nicely goes on to the work programme. You've got the forward plan for Cabinet, the 4-monthly one, and then you've got our forward plan. I think that the one thing that's been quite clear to me for some time, we're not getting enough, if to be blunt, of things through that members would like us to scrutinise. And then I think we're going to cover that on the training day, because I think it's really important that we get the right things to come through. Now, Ian, you've got your one outstanding on civil enforcement, and what we need you to do there is to fill out the form, which I'll get sent to you. There's a form that we then have to justify this is something we want to look at, and we would discuss it on the 28th.
So that's great, but I put that request in weeks ago now, so why am I being told today I've got to fill in a form?
It's part of a process. I'm only reading it now and realising we haven't seen the form. I can't say why you didn't know. I'm sorry about that. But we'll get one sent to you tomorrow. The sea wall, we're still waiting for Andrew to scope that, aren't we? And decide whether we're going to do that. On the water, all I'd say to you there, I'm still waiting for confirmation, but it does look, since we've had our meeting with South West Water, Devon have taken a view of that. The whole of Devon is now putting together a group to discuss South West Water, and it's whether or not us doing it separately would it be any value. I was still waiting for confirmation that was happening. Have we? Yeah, because if it's not happening, then we do need to have South West Water back. But if it is happening, it seems silly for us to have South West Water as well as Devon. Okay. Anything else? But I do think if people think about anything in the work programme, I do think that's important that we get some subjects that people would like to scrutinise. Yes.
I don't know if it's something for scrutiny or not, but I sent an email out this week with reference to the Remembrance Day parade on Sunday. My understanding is that some councillors get a district wreath provided for them. I was unaware of that, and I've been paying for one myself to lay as a district councillor since I joined the district council. But I'm also aware that other people they've told me that they've applied for a wreath and been told no, and that they're not going to be doing them moving forward. Now, as the member champion for the armed forces, I think that's terrible. They're only about £20 from the British Legion. Is that something I can bring to scrutiny to look into?
I would have thought that wouldn't need to come to scrutiny. I think that would, whoever is a decision maker on that need to make a decision at director level, I would have thought. And I don't know whose portfolio it would come under. Did you?
No, I don't. Vicky, if you want to email the query to me, I'll find a home for it. probably not for or probably I can get you an answer quicker.
Yes, Ian.
So, our next meeting, do we have something to talk about then, or not?
It's a joint budget meeting. We got a joint budget meeting and we got the training in November. That's our next two meetings.
Right. So, the one I put in about the enforcement, that I've got to fill in a form even though you've had the detail, or you need more detail?
That was discussed at the very first meeting, actually.
Well, I realise that, but as I said, I put it in and it came back, it was being considered, and I was waiting to hear from it. But no one said fill in the form and then we can consider it. It just seems, again, it's like no one wants us to look at anything.
Well, we do want to look at it, as long as you send it in, Ian, and we will find time to discuss it.
Right. I'll fill in the form then.
You do that.
But someone will send me a form so I can fill it in, even though I've had replies from people saying it will be considered. I'll let you know. They could have said then that they wanted a form filled in.
Maybe you could send the form to the committee so that if anybody
Actually,
else
that's not
has
a
got
bad
ideas,
point,
they
is
can
it?
follow that.
We'll send a form out to everybody so they've got it and they can just file it away for future. Okay, so I'd like to close the meeting now unless there's anything else anybody wishes to raise. Thank you very much for coming and a safe journey home.
Thank you. And don't use too much carbon.
Don't use too much carbon.